Welcome to the orlop deck. As we come up on Halloween and the Navy's 250th anniversary, I thought it would be fun, edifying, and perhaps just a little spooky to gather about the mess tonight and discuss some things that might or might not still be going bump in the night. The United States Navy celebrates its 250th anniversary this year. We trace our foundation back to the establishment of the Continental Navy on 13 October 1775. That's about 8 or 9 months before the Declaration of Independence founded the entire nation. Like all sea services, the Navy is filled with ships that go into harm's way and inevitably collect ghost stories as casualties mount either from disease or battle injury or just accidents. As we go into spooky season and mark the Navy's 250th anniversary, I thought it would be kind of fun to discuss some of the seagoing ghosts that might still be haunting the Navy's nightmares. And of course, what better place to start than all the way back at the beginning with the oldest commissioned warship afloat in the world, the venerable frigate USS Constitution. Launched in 1797, USS Constitution is one of the first 6 frigates authorized by Congress once the Constitution of the United States had established our current federal government. The Constitution and her sisters first came to prominence during the War of 1812. Now, if we're going to be honest, during the War of 1812, when it came to the land battles, the British wiped the floor with us. The reason that conflict was not a complete disaster for our nation was that Constitution and her sisters scored significant wins against the British at sea. Interestingly enough, for a ship that is over 228 years old, Constitution doesn't really have any dedicated ghost stories. It could be because Old Ironsides is still a commissioned warship and you have thousands of sailors tramping across her decks every year, keeping her in fighting trim. In a very real way, Constitution is still a living ship. That doesn't mean she's free from a few ghost stories that might be sailors who are still walking her decks, proud of their ship and willing to talk to visitors about anything under the overhead. Constitution captured 6 British warships between 1812 and 1815, providing some of the most significant American victories during the War of 1812. The ship herself came dangerously close to being captured on 16 July of 1812 when the local wind failed. The local wind around a ship can fail, leaving that ship becalmed and stranded while nearby ships still have wind in their sails and can maneuver. Constitution fell into one of these becalmed areas while 5 British warships were bearing down on her. Captain Isaac Hull acted on a recommendation from his first lieutenant, Charles Morris. Hull had the ship's boats put in the water. Some of the boats would start towing the 2,000-ton Constitution, while others carried the ship's anchors forward, then dropped them to the seabed. This allowed the ship to kedge forward by pulling herself along as she reeled in the anchor chains. The American sailors rowed and kedged for 3 days, staying just far enough ahead of the British to remain out of firing range until the wind finally picked it back up around Constitution on the 19th of July, and she could get the hell out of there. The frigate's first major victory was the capture of HMS Guerriere on 19 August of 1812. The battle between the warships was intense, but the fire and shot only burned hot for about an hour before Guerriere was forced to strike her colors. This was the famous battle which earned Constitution the nickname Old Ironsides. The British sailors described their shot bouncing off the American warship's stout oaken hull as though she were made of iron, and the nickname stuck. Later service in the Mediterranean and Pacific Squadron saw the ship take her place as an elder statesman of the Navy, but the Navy was fast running out of ideas of what to do with the aging ship. The ship lingered between the realms of the living and the dead for decades until she was suggested for use as a target ship intending to be sunk at sea. Moses Gleason, a Massachusetts businessman, read about this in 1905 and about had a heart attack. His efforts set off a tsunami of public opinion that spared the old warhorse from the guns of her sisters. Now beginning a tenuous life as a living Navy museum, the ship was renamed Old Constitution in 1917 in order to free the name up for a new battlecruiser. That battlecruiser never made it to sea, so the Navy rechristened Old Constitution back to Constitution in 1925. A nationwide penny drive that year raised money for the ship's first true major restoration. Old Ironsides then entered a decades-long cycle of hard-charging restorations followed by long periods of neglect as she would slowly begin to deteriorate while serving as a museum. As the nation neared its bicentennial, Constitution underwent another restoration, and this one established the precedent which is still maintained today. Constitution was restored to her 1812 appearance since that marked the era of her most significant service. Today, more than 50 years after the 1974 restoration, the Navy proudly keeps Old Ironside shipshape in Bristol fashion just as she looked in 1812. The Navy partners with the private USS Constitution Museum to ensure the ship is given regular maintenance and upkeep, while also ensuring her historical record is preserved and interpreted for future generations. A visit to Old Ironsides is a visit to a living time capsule, allowing Americans to have a direct link with the era in which the United States Navy began to find its sea legs. For such an old ship with such a remarkably varied and even fractured history, USS Constitution is oddly quiet on the spiritual front. There aren't really any definitive ghost stories haunting her past, but that doesn't mean her oaken form is free from spectral forms standing watch. Visitors and crew alike have reported hearing disembodied voices speaking to them, only to turn and see no one there. Others tell of encountering young sailors with weathered features sporting impeccably accurate 18th and 19th century uniforms. These sailors possess a shockingly intimate level of knowledge of old-style seakeeping, and the stories of these sailors always seem to end with the visitor looking away for a moment, only to turn back and discover that sailor had evaporated into thin air. Perhaps the reason the human ghosts are so infrequently seen is because the frigate herself is something of a living ghost. Old Ironsides is a warrior from an entirely different age, haunting our modern waterways with stately grace and cannons that can still fire a very dangerous broadside. Baltimore Harbor is a very historic place and very central to the history of the foundation of the United States. Today, the inner harbor, maintains a number of museum ships, one of which is the sloop of war USS Constellation. For a lot of years, there was a great debate raging about whether this Constellation was the original Constellation that was part of the first 6 frigates built with the Constitution back at the close of the 18th century. It took some scholarship and research over the years to finally prove this is not the same ship. For one, this Constellation is a sloop of war, which is a different warship than the original Constellation. The original Constellation was a frigate. Part of the confusion grows not just from the name, but the fact that the original Constellation was being broken up in Baltimore Harbor, while this Constellation was being built in Baltimore Harbor. Now, this Constellation represents a very unique point in Navy history and technology. This is the last all-sail ship ever built by our Navy. Every ship after this had a steam engine and later nuclear power. This ship marks the beginning of that transition period as the wooden Navy from the age of sail began to fade into history, and the technological mechanized Navy that we live with today started to come into being. This ship also has a few ghost stories that are much more what you would expect on a warship. Some of them are rather amusing. One of them is kind of gruesome. And one of them seems to be one of the ship's captains who has never actively relinquished his quarterdeck, but still walks his ship, making sure she is in fighting trim. Commissioned in 1855, Constellation is the very definition of the last of her kind. Once her hull touched the water, the Navy would build no more ships relying solely on wind and muscle to maneuver across the raging main. Constellation spent most of the Civil War in the Mediterranean and West Indies harassing Confederate commerce raiders, but took part in no decisive actions and finished the war as a receiving ship in Norfolk, Virginia. Later, while she operated as a Naval Academy training ship, Constellation was reconfigured to carry emergency cargo to Ireland during the efforts to fight the horrible 1879 famine, and her service saved thousands of lives. Constellation was already suffering an identity crisis as to whether she was a unique ship or the rebuilt 1797 frigate when, in 1914, Acting Secretary of the Navy Franklin Roosevelt ordered the Navy to fully restore her to her quote-unquote 1814 appearance. Like Constitution, Constellation was renamed to Old Constellation in 1917 to free her name up for a new battlecruiser, and just like Old Ironsides, Constellation regained her name when that battlecruiser was canceled in 1925. The ship actually ended up serving during World War II, although in a ceremonial role as Chief of Naval Operations Ernest King's Reserve flagship. She was finally decommissioned in 1955 and designated to become a museum. The debate about her identity now began to reach ballistic proportions because there was more than mere academic semantics in play. Her restoration and interpretation depended on whether she was the original 1797 frigate, just heavily modified, or whether she was a completely new ship that began her life in 1855. This debate was not finally put to rest until 1991 when an investigation, with help from the FBI no less, established beyond doubt this Constellation is not the 1797 ship. This Constellation was built new in 1855. Although it might seem that this dumped a loss of prestige aboard Constellation's deck, this revelation of her true identity actually enhances the historical provenance she holds. She is the last example of a fully wood and wind ship the Navy ever built. She took part in the final dissolution of the Atlantic slave trade, and that alone is a huge honor on the ship's scorecard. Plus, she saved thousands of lives in Ireland carrying emergency relief during that famine. Visiting the ship will allow you to step into a time warp back to a moment in history when everything was fluid. Commerce was evolving. Combat was changing. Technology was emerging that nobody had dreamed about. It might also let you come in contact with a few of the ghosts roaming the ship, although not all of them are friendly. However, not being friendly doesn't mean these spirits are dangerous. One of them is just rather sadly gruesome. This tragic tale relates the story of a sailor gone mad during the long, endless days aboard Constellation out on that endless sea. For weeks the ship had sailed in hot, dry waters. The sun beat down, the wind was scarce. The sailor went mad. He secretly fashioned a noose, scurried up the rigging, secured the line to the mast, stuck it over his head, and then leapt from the yardarm, hanging himself before his shipmates realized what he was doing. Today, you might be aboard the ship and hear the creaking of a rope far over your head, but if you look up to the yardarm, you'll likely see nothing. Unless it's at night, when people have looked up and reported seeing the form of a sailor swinging from that yardarm, hanging forever in the night. A rather whimsical tale, if slightly creepy, creeps up to us from the bowels of the ship. This story relates the tale of a sailor who was imprisoned in the brig for some long-forgotten infraction. While he was there, he reported that two of his shipmates who had died years before appeared to him as ghosts, asking him to sing so they could dance a jig, just like they did back in the old days. The story doesn't relate whether the sailor was happy to see his dead shipmates or terrified, but it does tell us that he began to sing for them so they could dance. Well, the Marine guards up on deck heard the prisoner singing, and in good Marine fashion, they tromped below decks to tell the prisoner to shut up because he was in the brig and he was not allowed to be having fun. But they stopped dead. They saw the sailor singing, but unlike him, they didn't see any ghosts. What they did see was some pots and pans floating in midair around the sailor, as though being held by unseen hands dancing a jig. The Marines turned about smartly, marched back up on deck, and proceeded to go back to their duties. Of course, visitors have reported enthusiastically following many tour guides that may not be from this world, one of whom wears the uniform of a ship's captain. Following this man around, visitors are amazed at his affection and knowledge for the decks he walks on, the absolute intimate details he can tell them about life at sea when he commanded Constellation. Inevitably, the visitors look away when he points something out, only to turn back and find that the old sea dog has vanished. Make of it what you will, but Constellation is home to a great deal of American history, and some of it seems to be coming from the other side. World War II was the most catastrophic conflict in human history. It is a conflict from which we are still experiencing the aftershocks. A number of the geopolitical conflicts and cultural clashes that are happening around the globe today in the 21st century are the results of the fighting that took place from the 1930s to 1945. The United States came out of that conflict as the premier military power because we had the biggest navy and the best economy. We could afford to preserve a lot of our warships as museum ships. One of these is the venerable battleship USS Alabama BB-60. Today a museum ship here, well, not here, I'm in Pensacola, but she's over in Mobile Harbor, not that far away from me. She sees millions of visitors annually tromping her decks and getting a look at what life in World War II at sea was like, because she was decommissioned in 1947. She never went through any of the upgrades to modernize her to the technologies of the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s like the later Iowa-class battleships all did. The Alabama is a time capsule showing you exactly what sailors and Marines lived aboard during World War II. Known as the Lucky A, Alabama holds a very special distinction as being one of the few American warships that never lost a single sailor to enemy action. That doesn't mean, however, she did not lose sailors. One of her most enduring ghost stories comes from the fact that one of her gun crews perished at the hands of their own during a horrifically tragic friendly fire incident. Commissioned on the 16th of August in 1942, USS Alabama first saw service in the Atlantic. Sailing with the British Home Fleet, she helped escort convoys through icy Arctic seas to resupply the Soviet Union. She saw no significant action in that theater, but the Lucky A quickly traded in the frigid waters of the Arctic for the torrid waters of the Pacific Ocean. Alabama's first action came during the invasion of Tarawa on 20 November 1943 as the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaign kicked off. The battleship spent the rest of the war in the Pacific, supporting troops ashore with her big guns while providing anti-aircraft cover for the fleet. It was during action off the Marianas in February of 1944 that Alabama suffered her only combat casualties, and these were caused by a tragic friendly fire incident. The number 9 5-inch mount overtracked with enemy fighters, resulting in the guns firing directly into nearby mount number 5. 5 sailors were killed and 11 were injured. The Lucky A earned 9 battle stars, all of them in the Pacific. Although no official tally of aircraft downed was kept, one can be reasonably certain the ship's guns put a sizable dent in the aircraft available to the Japanese Navy. The ship opened her decks to visitors as a permanent museum in 1964 and has quickly become one of the star attractions bringing visitors to Mobile, Alabama. Today she echoes with both recorded sounds, such as down in the engine room to give visitors an idea of the conditions her crew experienced, as well as the bustling conversations of guests, tour guides, and the occasional World War II veteran returning to see their old ship. This lively atmosphere makes it kind of hard for any self-respecting ghost to be heard using the traditional ghostly methods self-respecting ghosts tend to use. You might hear disembodied footsteps on deck, but most likely those are just visitors coming from another compartment heading your way. The one part of the ship where spirits do seem intent on making themselves known is the number 5 5-inch mount on the ship's starboard side. Visitors to this gun mount have often reported seeing and even talking to young men in perfect World War II dungarees. Young men who then just vanish into the mists of time when visitors turn away, or even walk through steel bulkheads on their way to get back to duties that have been long ago fulfilled. Perhaps it's because, as victims of friendly fire instead of enemy fire, they're often overlooked by those who extol the virtues and sacrifices of the dead from World War II. When you visit the ship, make sure you pay your respects at Mount Number 5. At the very least, you'll be honoring Americans who sacrificed their lives to build the world we live in. But you never know. Those same sailors might just repay your gesture of respect by appearing across the chasm of time and death in order to give you a truly inside account of life during World War II. Seawolf Park in Galveston, Texas is an amazing place to go visit. You drive up and you park on this beautiful facility and you look right across the ground at the 2 ships that are sailing right through the grass. A very unusual sight. A World War II submarine and a World War II destroyer escort landlocked in the ground. It might seem funny to dry dock a ship like this, but If you dry dock a museum ship, you don't have to worry about it sinking. And the Gulf Coast, we are hurricane country. If you dry dock a museum ship, you also don't need to worry about a hurricane making that ship get underway when you don't want it to. Seawolf Park is home to the destroyer escort USS Stewart DE-238 and the submarine USS Cavella SS-244. Cavella holds a very unique place in Navy history. On her first war patrol, this submarine sank the Japanese carrier Shokaku. Shokaku was one of the 6 carriers that bombed Pearl Harbor, and in 1944, Shokaku and Zuikaku were the last 2 of that 6 still afloat. Cavella also holds a unique distinction in that not only does the seagoing ghost aboard her clearly not a seagoing ghost anymore because the ship is landlocked, but the ghost, at least the one that seems to come up a great deal, is not even human. Commissioned on 29 February 1944, the Gato-class submarine USS Cavella gained immediate fame by sinking the Japanese carrier Shokaku. Sailing under the command of Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kostler, Cavella had been stalking the giant but as yet unidentified carrier for nearly 2 days before finally striking her with a torpedo salvo on 19 June. Weighing in at over 30,000 tons, Shokaku was the 5th of the 6 Pearl Harbor carriers to be sunk and was one of the 3 biggest ships sunk during all of World War II. Once the attack and sinking had been confirmed, Cavella was swiftly awarded a rare and much coveted Presidential Unit Citation. The submarine conducted 6 war patrols and was awarded, in addition to the Presidential Unit Citation, 4 battle stars and credit for sinking over 34,180 tons of shipping, 30,000 tons of which was the Shokaku by herself. Cavella was decommissioned and recommissioned numerous times during the post-war era. She underwent numerous modifications as the Navy transitioned through the rapid technological changes of the Cold War. She was finally stricken from the Naval Register in 1969 and transferred to become a museum ship in Texas in 1971. Later joined at Pelican Island in Galveston Bay by the destroyer escort USS Stewart DE-238, the 2 ships suffered such neglect that they were nearly scrapped. Numerous civic efforts revitalized the ships and created the modern Galveston Naval Museum to operate and maintain them. Visitors can spend hours exploring both vessels, discovering just how life aboard tiny destroyer escorts and submarines was different from that aboard bigger vessels like carriers and battleships. Cavella seems to be the center of a great deal of paranormal activity, but much of that might stem from Galveston's long history. Pelican Island itself has seen storms, shipwrecks, slaves, and long-forgotten battles between Native American tribes. However, a paranormal investigation aboard the ship in 2011-2012 turned up the recording of a very surprising sound: the barking of a dog. Navy policy forbids the bringing of animals aboard as mascots or pets, but sailors during World War II often ignored this regulation during those hot, frightening days in the Pacific Theater. Cavella's logs don't mention any dogs, of course, but the submarine made at least 3 port calls to Australia during the war, and some of her veterans have told of adopting a dingo dog during one of those visits. Perhaps that dingo is still there, romping through the submarine in an eternal game of chase with its long-forgotten crewmates. When you step aboard Cavella, take some time to ponder the serendipity which led a brand new boat to sink one of the Navy's greatest foes on her first war patrol. And also, listen carefully. You might just hear the barking of a dog that had been brought aboard as a source of comfort and joy for young men far from home fighting to the death under a lonely sea. If you're really lucky, perhaps you might even feel a friendly cold nose nuzzling your hand as this pooch from the past seeks to have its ghostly ears scratched one more time. One thing that's always struck me about ghost stories is how many of them are told because you heard it from somebody who heard it from somebody who heard it from somebody. A friend of a friend of a friend who had an Aunt Susan whose grandmother's friend heard it. If that sounds like folklore mythology, it's because that's how folklore and mythology grow. A story is started, whatever the factual basis of that story, it is started by somebody who relates it to somebody, and it's told and becomes part of the fabric of our culture, even if the original truth of it might have been obscured by the mists of time. You never know. Not all ghost stories, though, are just I heard it from somebody who heard it from somebody, or the staff at the museum hired paranormal investigators who said this. Sometimes you actually run into the people who saw the ghost or ghosts. Sometimes those people are even here on YouTube doing a video. When I was stationed aboard USS Ponce LPD-15, last of the Austin-class amphibious transport docks, twice I had an encounter that I can only describe as either a ghost or the ghost of fatigue pulling my mind into another dimension. Early in 2010, we were underway, and I was heading as far aft on the ship as you can to the aft line handling room. Now, this is a part of the ship that's running alongside the well deck, and the well deck is what we ballast and we flood the well deck so landing craft can come in and out. Unlike your traditional ghost story with only one way in and one way out of the compartment, this compartment, the aft line handling room, had two ways in and two ways out. The way coming through the wing wall that I was headed, and a small hatch that would lead you to the catwalk overlooking the well deck. What's key to this story is this guy I saw ahead of me never turned right, which is where he would have to go through the hatch out to the well deck. He turned left, and I never saw him again. As I'm walking, I look up and I see another sailor in blue coveralls. That's what's interesting. It was not dungarees, one of the older uniforms. This was blue coveralls, which what we normally wore in 2010. Walking ahead of me in the aft line handling room, I just glanced up, saw this form of this guy walking there and cut left. Well, the only thing cutting left would be technically turning outboard, but looking at some shelving that's built into the steel of the skin of the ship, because you're right there at the aft end of the ship, but there's nowhere to go. I don't even remember why I was going there that night, especially that late. I was a ship's public affairs officer, so I think maybe I was just trucking around looking for stuff to photograph or find stuff that might be an interesting story. But anyway, I finish trumping all the way to the aft end of the ship, walk into the starboard aft line handling room, and I start to say hello to nobody. There's nobody in this compartment but me. A couple years later, we were moored in Norfolk at our home port, and I was on watch with one of our chiefs. It was middle of the night. We're near the ship's armory. We're on the main deck, the weather deck, with our quarterdeck set up on the ship's starboard side. We're moored starboard side in. The ship's armory was reached by going through a deck hatch that was open, one deck down, to a vestibule. In that vestibule, the only thing you could do was either turn around and come back up or go through a cipher lock door into the armory. Obviously, the armory's kept very tightly controlled. It was midnight or 1, and it was January, February. It was cold. So we're sitting there, we're shivering, we're talking, having hot coffee. And both he and I glance over at the same time to the deck hatch that's open, looking down to the armory, and we both see a hand on it, like, you put a hand on the hatch as you're climbing down. We both see a hand, and the hand disappears. And the chief says, "Did you just see that?" I said, "Yeah, somebody went in the armory." The chief looks at his watch. It is not anywhere near shift change. Who the hell is in there? Go see who's trying to get in the armory. I'm like, okay, so I walk over and I look down into the vestibule from the upper deck, and you can see the whole vestibule. Nada. So I walk back over and tell the chief that there's nobody there. That either whoever it was must have gone in the armory. And chief looks at his watch and he's like, "Well, it's not nowhere near shift change. Nobody should be in there." So he calls one of the gunner's mates who's on duty. And the guy comes over and chief tells him, "We think somebody went in the armory. Are you guys doing a shift change?" And the gunner's mate says, "No, nobody should be in there." He goes down there to check. Comes back up. "Chief, there's nobody in there. The lock hasn't been accessed." Chief thanks him. The gunner's mate heads back to where he was doing. Chief looks at me. "Miller, you saw somebody going down in there, didn't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I saw somebody put their hand right up on the hatch like they're walking down, and then the hand disappears." And she says, "That's what I saw. But nobody's in there." And I just looked at her and said, "It must be the ship's ghost." Chief looked at me. I said, "Well, a couple years ago, I could swear I saw somebody walking into the aft line handling room right ahead of me, and nobody was there." So Chief just laughed and he shook his head, and we just talked about other things the rest of the evening. Ponce has sadly been scrapped since after she was decommissioned. But I've always wondered, was the first time the aft line handling room underway, middle of the night, other side of the planet, was that just my fatigue playing tricks on me? I'm perfectly open to that. I love the idea of a ghost story. I love the idea of encountering the supernatural because that means there's a mystery happening, something mysterious outside of our experience. Those are wonderful things. But I'm also a sailor in the middle of the night who's dead tired. I could have been hallucinating. It's possible. But that night with Chief, with that chief on watch, where two of us saw the exact same thing at the same time, and nobody was there. And before anybody says, well, the gunner's mate might have lied, there's nobody down in there, it's possible, but the gunner's mate who came and who was on duty, I knew the guy. He was a real stand-up guy. He was not a practical joker. I will stand by saying that twice on that ship, I saw somebody who was there and yet at the same time was not there. You have to be the judge. But that's what makes ghost stories so much fun. They're spooky, they're mysterious, and there often is never a really good, solid, definitive answer. It's a mystery. And the mystery is what draws us to speculate about what might be happening out there in the great unknown, and how might that be impacting our world here under the sun. Well, thank you for joining me down here on the orlop deck, far below the hustle and bustle of the main deck above us. I hope you found these tales of seagoing ghosts and ghouls entertaining and edifying, and perhaps just a little enlightening about life at sea over the years. Have a very safe and happy Halloween. And to all of my shipmates, past, present, and future, happy 250th anniversary to the United States Navy. Until we meet here again on Sparks 1524, go do some great things.